It's a very good question. Under the Obama administration, is there going to be anything left in January 2017? Yes. Listen, the threats to this country are extraordinary. But there's a resiliency to America. This nation is strong. And let's be clear, the next year and a half are going to be profoundly dangerous. As radical as this president has been for 6.5 years, in his final sprint, he's going to be worse. But ironically, the worse he gets, the more optimistic I get. Because sometimes things have to get really bad to startle people out of their slumber. You know, it took Jimmy Carter to give us Ronald Reagan. And every time Obama screws something up again, he is setting the stage for new and principled leadership in this country that brings us back to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that built America.
FDR had the fireside chats. When you're president, would you have maybe a 5-minute update every week in front of the American people, showing how maybe you yourself, by example, save money? For instance, fewer Air Force One trips, fewer games, fewer golf games, and you're there working. You're not, taking advantage of the American people's taxpayer money.
Well, I can tell you now, I'm a lousy golfer. Yes, I think it's actually a terrific idea, and it's one of the great things about modern technology is the ability to communicate directly with the American people. If you look at how we're trying to wage our campaign, it's coming from the grassroots. You look at the media. You may have noticed they're not our friends. The media are not fair and impartial. They are Obama's biggest protectors, and no one is more rooting for Hillary than the mainstream media. And any Republican that doesn't get that doesn't understand who they're dealing with. Now, how do you handle that? Look, when Reagan was president, they hated Reagan too. They ridiculed him constantly. And what did Reagan do? Just like you pointed out with FDR, Reagan went right over the heads of the media and straight to the American people. And back then, it was much harder. Back then, you had 3 major networks in the newspaper. Now, we've got cable TV. We've got Fox News. We've got talk radio, which didn't exist. We've got the internet. We've got the Drudge Report. We've got social media. We've got the ability to communicate right around all the self-decreed gatekeepers. One of my favorite examples of that. There was a press conference at the White House when Reagan was president. Sam Donaldson, remember from ABC? Sam Donaldson stood up and said, Mr. President, you have blamed the problems in this country on Tip O'Neill. You blamed them on the Democrats. You blamed them on everybody else. Mr. President, you're President of the United States. Don't you bear any of the responsibility for the problems in this country? And Reagan leaned forward, with a twinkle in his eye, and said, well, Sam, yes, I do. I bear considerable responsibility because for many years, I was a Democrat. And if you Google it, even Sam Donaldson cracks up laughing in response to that. That's how we communicate and go straight to the people. Yes, sir.
I like the weather. I'm also a computer programmer, so I think it's awesome. This is a little technical question, but in 1919, the federal government, in compliance with the 1910th Amendment, passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution to legitimize the prohibition of alcohol, making it constitutionally legitimate. Do you believe a similar amendment is needed to legitimize the war on drugs?
It's a good question. My view, do I believe it is necessary to legitimize the war on drugs? No. And if you look at, for example, Prohibition is not viewed kindly by historians or most Americans as a successful effort. And in that instance, it was a constitutional amendment attempting to strike down all those laws, and is the only amendment we've ever repealed because it didn't work very well. Although I will say this, when it comes to drug policy, listen, drug addiction is a serious problem. It is a problem families across this country struggle with. In my family, my sister passed away. And she struggled with drug and alcohol addiction most of her adult life. And she died of an accidental overdose. So I've seen firsthand what can flow from this. You know, I think there are good faith policy arguments that people can have that our current approach is not being as successful as it is. I think there's a lot of good arguments, for example, increasing treatment and prevention rather than just incarcerating people, particularly for nonviolent offenses. It's one of the reasons I'm one of the co-sponsors of the Smarter Sentencing Act, to reduce and eliminate mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenders, and instead to move towards treatment and rehabilitation, helping them overcome their addiction. Yes, sir.
I am becoming very concerned with the amount of power that the Supreme Court is getting. What can be done about this judicial tyranny?
Great question. The gentleman said he's becoming very concerned with the power the Supreme Court is getting. What can be done about this judicial tyranny? You know, we have a Supreme Court that is out of control. In June of last year, in a period of 24 hours, this court issued 2 decisions that were an absolute travesty. The first, a handful of justices on the Supreme Court ignored federal law, rewrote Obamacare in order to force that failed law on millions of Americans. And then 24 hours later, a handful of unelected federal judges purported to strike down the marriage laws of all 50 states and decree that what had been marriage for over 200 years suddenly and magically in the U.S. Constitution no longer was permissible to be marriage. Now, there are a number of candidates in the Republican field who, when that decision came down, they essentially waved the white flag. They said, it's settled, it's the law of the land, we surrender, we accept, we give up, move on. Now, I got to say, it is astonishing to see Republican presidential candidates reading word for word the talking points of Barack Obama. My view is very different. That decision was fundamentally illegitimate, it was lawless, it was judicial activism, and it is found nowhere in the Constitution.
That's right.
So you asked what we can do about it. On the Obamacare front, I've already pledged my #1 legislative priority will be repealing every word of it. On marriage, I've introduced a constitutional amendment to protect the authority of state legislatures to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. I've introduced legislation in Congress stripping the federal courts and the Supreme Court from any jurisdiction over challenges to marriage. And the most important difference, the one that will happen the fastest, the next president in all likelihood will appoint anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 to even 4 Supreme Court justices. Listen, Republicans in the past, many of the worst judicial activists were put on the bench by Republicans because they were unwilling to risk the political capital, unwilling to fight for a jurist who had a record as a principled constitutional conservative. I have spent, without exaggeration, my entire life fighting judicial activism, starting when I was a law clerk to Chief Justice William Rehnquist on the Supreme Court, going on to spending over a decade litigating before the court, defending the Constitution and winning conservative victories one after the other after the other. I give you my word, there are few, if any, decisions I will take more seriously than a Supreme Court nominee, and every justice I put on the court will faithfully follow the law and will not impose his or her policy from the bench.
What are your plans to take away Common Core? Because I used to have straight A's in math, and ever since Common Core came here, I haven't.
You know, to our folks in the media, I would love for y'all to get this young lady's question. How old are you? 13. What grade are you in? 7. So the question that what's your name? Grace, who's 13 and in 7th grade, she just asked, what can you do to end Common Core? She said she used to have straight A's in math, and now you said you've got F's?
Yeah, I can tell you right now I have
Look, If you look at Common Core, in my view, the federal government, under the Constitution, has no business sticking its nose in education. Education belongs at the state level, or even better, the local level. And the reason for that is you have accountability. If your local school board does something that doesn't make any sense, you and your parents and your family, you have direct accountability. You'll see the school board members at the grocery store. You'll be able to say, look, what you're doing doesn't make any sense. And you know what? If they don't listen to you, you can run against them and throw the bum out. If you have a policy that comes from some unelected bureaucrats in the bowels of the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., they don't care what you think or I think or anyone else thinks. Most of them have never been to Iowa. They couldn't even find it on a map, which is why the Common Core geography standards are so bad. Iowa's the panhandle down on the Atlantic, is that right? But here's the good news. If you look at how the Obama administration has forced Common Core on the states, it's used what are called race-to-the-top funds, federal funds that through abusing the executive power of the federal government, they're coercing and bludgeoning the states into adopting these standards. Now, everything done with executive power can be undone with executive power. And so on day one, on January 20th, 2017, those federal mandates will end, and we will leave it to the states to define the curriculum that makes sense for the students. All right, I'm going to wrap up with something else, which is twofold. Number one, I just want to make an ask of each of you. If you guys agree that our country's in crisis, if you agree that it's now or never, if you agree that Washington isn't listening to the American people, then my ask of you is very simple: join us. We're building a grassroots army across the state of Iowa and across the country. I would ask every one of you, if you share that urgency, sign up and volunteer. Join us. Commit to come caucus for us in February, and volunteer to be part of the county leadership, part of the precinct leadership. Volunteer to reach out to your friends, to your family, to your neighbors, and say, come out to this election. It matters. Our campaign, the momentum we have right now, it is surging, and it is surging because of the men and women in this room. It is surging because of the power of the grassroots coming from the people. And listen, I'll be very candid with you. I can't win this race. It is beyond my ability and beyond my capacity to win this race. But together, we can win this race. The only way we can win this race is if it comes from the grassroots and comes from the people. And with that, what I want to do, just to wrap up, is I want to introduce you to my wife, Heidi Cruz. So Heidi is beautiful. She's brilliant. She's a California blonde. She's an amazing businesswoman. She is a phenomenal mom to our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine, who are the joys of our life. She has exceptionally poor eyesight. I like it. A few people, that took a second. And she's my best friend in the whole world. Heidi, would you come out and say a few words to folks?
This is my favorite part of the campaign trail. So yes, I would love to come out and say a few things, especially since he's leaving. I can say whatever I want. This is really the joy of campaigning, is being out here on the road, meeting each and every one of you, understanding what you are doing in your lives, what your kids are doing, what you care about, what your dreams are for this country, because my guess is that we share those. And we're in Texas. This is a different part of the country, but we have some Dear people, close friends, a woman who lives with us who's from Iowa, and so we feel a special kinship to your state. And I've been here many, many times with Ted, and there are a lot of common bonds with Texas. Ted, since Ted left for just a minute, he's doing a press interview of some sort. I wanted to just take the opportunity to give you a sense of why I'm supporting Ted. Just like every one of you, I had a choice. You laugh. Of course the wife has to support. No, of course the wife does not have to support. And I had a choice to make as to whether or not I would take a leave of absence from my job, leave my 2 girls who are 4 and 7 years old, and really, really work alongside Ted for our country. And at the beginning, I had a moment of hesitation, like any thoughtful spouse would. Should we do this? And when I thought about doing it for Ted, I wasn't sure that I should. And when I thought about doing it for our country and what Ted and all of you can do for our country, there was no decision at all. This is where God has placed all of us, not Ted and I, but all of us in this room, to take our country back. There are people all over this nation that share our values, and we have to call them out to vote. I'll give you a little bit of a background on how Ted and I met. What I found extraordinarily compelling about Ted when I first met him, and then what I've seen him do in the U.S. Senate as a senator that I think are some of the values and characteristics that he possesses as a person that have caused him to do the right thing for our country. Because Ted and I both think that this election is going to come down to trust. Who do the American people, and in the primary, who do conservatives trust on shared values and then winnability? Because if we share values but we can't win, we have to retool. If we elect somebody that we don't share our values, then it's probably not worth all the work. And then I'll close by the path to victory, how I think that Ted wins not only the primary, but also against the Democrats in November 2016 for you all. Ted and I met in 2000. It was January 2, 2000. I grew up in California in a very conservative Christian home. My family are all in the medical field, but they're missionaries. We've served all over the world in Africa. My brother is a doctor in Haiti. And I had never been to Texas, and I'd never been involved in politics. But I started to get a little bit involved in college. And then a number of years later, I went down to Texas to work on the Bush campaign. And this was the 2000 election when George W. Bush was running as a movement conservative. He had a lot of momentum behind his race, and Ted and I met on that campaign and ended up, I think it was a God thing, but working on every single project together. And it was very clear to me within the first couple days that we really needed each other. Ted is extraordinary. I'm not a big risk taker, and I'm not quick to judgment. But after the first week of knowing Ted Cruz, I knew that this was a qualitatively different kind of individual. For a couple reasons. One, in our late 20s, Ted knew what he believed. And what he believed then and what he was doing then is the exact same thing that he believes now and is doing now. And the reason for that is his parents raised him on the Bible and the Constitution, and it was taught at the dinner table. He memorized the Constitution as a grade schooler, but not only did he memorize it, he was part of an organization where they sent 8th graders out to Rotary clubs all over the state of Texas to defend the Constitution, to take questions from the adults in the room for over an hour about the meaning of the amendments and the purpose behind them and the history and the intention. And that background has allowed him to apply the Constitution and the founding of our country to present-day events, I think, in an extraordinary way. The second thing that really was compelling about Ted professionally is just how articulate he is. We have not seen a conservative who can communicate in decades like Ted Cruz can. And it's really useful. It's really, really useful to winning. And the third thing that you will see come out over time, and you know it from what he's done in the Senate, Ted is incredibly sincere and thoughtful. And I want you to know, as his wife, someone who knows him better than anybody else, he's that way at home too. He never forgets a date. He never forgets a birthday. He came home from the campaign. Actually, it was pre-campaign. It was Valentine's, but he was already out there. And we had already kind of done Valentine's. I'd gotten some flowers for his mother and for myself and for the other women in our lives because I knew Ted wouldn't have time. And he came in that morning with huge flowers for everyone in the family and chocolates for our little girls. Ted would never miss the opportunity to celebrate somebody else and to be there for people when they need him. So that's what was very compelling to me about Ted when we met. When I think about Ted's career in the Senate, and I know you all have talked quite a bit about policy issues today and what he's running on and our shared values, but how do you trust someone that they're really going to do this? And I think that comes down to what are his qualities as a person. And sometimes there's no better way to find that out than by talking to a spouse. And I'll tell you, the number one quality that I think Ted has is courage. This is a courageous person. And one of the ways that he articulated that is his very first summer in office. He campaigned on standing up for the Second Amendment, defunding Obamacare, standing up for our constitutional liberties. And in the very first summer that he was in office, we had the tragedy at Sandy Hook, Connecticut, with the shooting in the school. The Democrats tried to use that as an opportunity to dismantle our Second Amendment rights. And it took courage in a time that was very emotional for this country, at a time when he would be very easily made to look like the bad guy, to stand up and call right from wrong and say this will not be solved by going after law-abiding citizens and breaking down our Constitution. And he and Mike Lee went around the country that whole summer. I was asking, what do most senators do on recess in August? And Ted didn't ask himself that question. It didn't matter what others were doing. He spent every single moment that he wasn't voting getting millions and millions of Americans to call their congressional member and ask them to vote no on dismantling our Second Amendment rights. The second thing that he has done that's really, I think, been important for our country is he will do what he says he's going to do. He campaigned, Ted campaigned in Texas on defunding Obamacare, and when no one else thought there was a way, he had a detailed 5-point strategy that he and a couple others went and articulated through the House, and they got to the Senate, and it failed in the Senate. But he went up there, was not going to be deterred by all the winds were against him. No one thought that it could be done. And even though 67% of the American people are against Obamacare, there was not more than a handful of elected officials on Capitol Hill that were willing to put any political capital on the line to do what you've all asked them to do. And Ted was relentless, clear through the filibuster in trying to defund Obamacare. And a lot of people said this will be a failure. You shut down the government. What was it? What did it achieve? It achieved a resounding victory for Republicans in 2014, underscoring that we need to elect leaders that do what we ask them to do. The third thing that I've really loved about Ted, both personally and professionally, is he never makes decisions based on assumption. So he does not look around the room to see how others are voting. He does not jump to conclusions. He will always do the fundamental bottoms-up research. It's hard on the team sometimes. Sometimes they have to do a lot of extra work. But his vote on Loretta Lynch is a good example. He came home one Thursday night and I said, I guess you're going to vote no on Loretta Lynch. Everyone's asking me. I assume you will. I mean, why don't you just save yourself the time and vote no? And he said, no, I have not interviewed her yet. I don't know her. And rumor has it that she has a poor record and is very liberal, but I'm going to ask her the questions of the Constitution about how she's going to behave going forward. And I'm going to sit down with her, and he spent an hour and a half with her in his office and asked her a number of very basic questions with no assumptions. And he said, if I come out of that believing and knowing that she will follow the Constitution, I would consider it. She gave him the craziest answers. He asked her, would you uphold the law? You're appointed by the executive branch. Under the Constitution, there are limits on executive power. As the Attorney General of the United States, is there anything that the President could do that would cause you to follow the Constitution and limit his executive power? She said, absolutely not. I'm appointed by President Obama, and there's nothing that I would ever do. We had Janet Reno, who indicted President Clinton. When Ted knew in his gut that she was not the kind of Attorney General we should have, he voted against her. And one should take note that a lot of Republicans in Congress did not vote against her. Ted will never do things based on assumption. And we don't want him to for our values either. We want him to find what's true. And Ted does the hard work to do that. So those are the things that I think will make a great leader for our country. I think our Congress will behave differently when we have a strong president who's fighting for conservative values. And Ted can win. We might all say, we've been sitting here for an hour, this is great, we love what Ted's running on, but can he win? We keep losing elections over and over. And I'll tell you, Ted and I are so incredibly encouraged because we can all win this race. And here's how. When you look at the general election, Ted will often say there are consultants in Washington who over and over and over say we need to elect a moderate so that in the general we can unite this country. And guess what? Every single time we do, we lose. And the reason is the base of our wonderful party are true believers in our values. And a lot of people won't turn out and vote and just vote for someone because they're a Republican. We all want to vote for someone that we actually believe in. And in the last election, the last 2 election cycles, there are huge numbers of the base of our party that have been staying home. So if you take about 220 million people that can vote in this country, 90 million of them are evangelical Christian voters. They're about 80% Republican, 20% Democrat. That group has been staying home in huge numbers. They turned out in 2004 for George W. Bush. They stayed home at the tune of about 37 million in 2008, and 54 million stayed home in 2012. Romney only lost by 5 million votes. We need to turn out people that are like-minded to us. The second thing is, when you do believe in something and you're true to it, some Democrats will come over. There are Democrats that are pro-life. There are Democrats that are hard-working people who want lower taxes. There's only one president who has Democrats named after them, and that is Reagan Democrats. Those wonderful people are in our country. We've met with so many of them in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. I believe that they will turn out for Ted in the general election. And then you look at the primary, and we cannot control what happens in this primary. All we can do is do what Ted does well and come out and meet with millions and millions of Americans and have him look you in the eye and tell you who he is, and you take a measure of him. And you have the opportunity to do that in Iowa, and we're so grateful that you take your responsibility so seriously. Because for those who only see him through the veil of the media is scared to death by Ted Cruz. And they will try everything they can to not talk about our campaign, to not cover our events, but you have the opportunity here to turn out and caucus and to turn out the state for Ted. There are a lot of other candidates in the race. The field is narrowing. We are building our campaign to last. I've been very active on the financial side as well to try to raise money for the campaign, and we have a fabulous effort where we have 340,000 donations from all over the country. Our average donation size is about $68. And we also have large dollar donors who are giving thousands to the campaign. There's no other campaign in this race that has both. And so all of your hard work is being supported by others, and all of their hard work is, we're all supporting each other, and we're using technology to do it as well. And that means that we actually have the highest cash on hand number from what we can tell of the campaigns. And there are some really good people who are in the race who dropped out. People drop out because of the financial situation. So we will be very, very good stewards of anything that you can send our way. Ted often says, people ask him if he has a private jet. He says, yes, it's a 737. It's blue, and it says Southwest Airlines on the side. And we get free drinks. So thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting Ted. And together we can win this race. And please tell your friends and neighbors, please come out. Please get to know our leadership team. Brian English, our state director, is here. We're so grateful to have Brian on board. He's made a huge, huge difference. He's an incredible leader. He's a pastor, has an amazing family. And we were the first campaign, I think the only campaign to date, to announce county leadership in every single county in Iowa and in the first 4 states. We have the ground game to go the distance. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and I look forward to meeting you.
As Heidi mentioned, my name is Brian English. I'm the state director for Ted Cruz for President, and just a couple of things. Hopefully you're excited about this process. I obviously hope that you're excited about Ted Cruz. I see some of the buttons and the T-shirts, and we're really glad to have you here.